owns it. We could adopt it," she said, grinning at me. I grinned back. "Well, we have the key," I said. We were standing in a large, crowded field. In the distance was the ghostly outline of the old priory, lit up in parts by the flames of a huge, crackling bonfire. Suddenly, there was a loud bang and sizzle, and showers of silver and blue sparkles exploded into the night sky, creating vivid arched patterns in the darkness, before falling like glittery rain back down to the earth. There were cries of "ooh" and "ah" from the assembled townspeople, who all appeared to have turned out for the town's fireworks display. With a mouthful of hot dog, I motioned to Rachel to take a look at a small group of people standing with their backs to us in the near distance. One of the ladies was tall and thin, with bright scarlet hair. I mumbled something unintelligible to Rachel, and at the same time managed to spill fried onions down the front of my coat. "Mum," said Rachel, handing me a paper napkin. "Honestly." "Thanks," I said, taking the napkin from her. "Did you hear what I said?" "Nope, not a word," said Rachel, helping me wipe off the tomatoey onion. "It's Fee Grange, standing over there, the tall lady with the bright hair. You know, I told you I spoke to her this afternoon." "Oh, yeah," said Rachel, nodding and turning to look at the tall lady. "I wonder if that's her sister Mern standing next to her," I said. "Well, there's only one way to find out," said Rachel. "Let's go and speak to them." Just as we were about to head in the direction of Fee Grange and her companions, a large lady in a huge coat bustled her way up to us. "I thought it was you," said the large woman in a loud voice. "It was Gran from Chaplin's bookshop." I smiled and began to introduce her to Rachel. "Ooh, you look very familiar, young lady," said Gran, eyeing her up and down. "Have we met before?" "Nope," said Rachel, shaking her head and looking away self-consciously. "Oh, I could have sworn. Anyway, this is Mrs. Fogg from the cafe in the High Street," she continued, pointing to a small, timid-looking woman standing next to her, who was gripping hold of a little handbag tightly with both hands. "I was telling her you were looking for books today." Rachel looked at me wide-eyed, and I gave her a "don't go there" look with my eyes. She grinned back at me and looked down at her feet, trying to suppress a giggle. "She knows a lot about the history of the town, don't you, Beryl?" said Gran, nudging the woman's shoulder. Beryl nodded at Gran and then squished her face at me. "Onion rings," she said suddenly, pointing to the sleeve of my coat. "Oops," I said, brushing the limp vegetables onto the floor. I had an accident with a hot dog before. "Beryl doesn't like hot dogs, do you, Beryl? Or fireworks?" said Gran, leaning over and shouting the question loudly into Beryl's ear. "Not really," said Beryl nervously. "If it was up to me, I'd be tucked up in bed with a cup of Ovaltine and a Catherine Cookson novel by now." "Tell 'em what you know about Monk's Ferry," said Gran, ignoring her friend's answer and continuing to bellow in her ear. "What do they want to know?" said Beryl, looking puzzled. "What do you want to know?" shouted Gran in our direction. Rachel and I looked at each other perplexed. "Oh, you've caught us of silver and gold glitter. Beryl jumped and clutched even more tightly to her handbag. Rachel looked over at me with a jaded expression, and I knew that was my cue to bring the conversation to an end. "Well, we must be going," I said, hurriedly, to Gran and Beryl. "It was very nice to meet you both. I'll be popping into the bookshop tomorrow morning to pick up my book. Will you be there?" "Not if I can help it," said Gran. "Awful musty place. My husband Arthur should be there, back on his feet. You can chat with him." And with that, Gran reached for Beryl's elbow and yanked her away in the direction of the hot dog stand. Rachel looked at me in bewilderment. "What book?" she said. "Oh, I wanted it to be a surprise," I said. "Now I've ruined it." "Ruined what?" "Well, I might as well tell you. When I popped into Chaplin's Books this morning to pick up the tickets, there was a copy of the Reverend Griffin's book on the history of Monk's Ferry there, like the one in the library, and I just had to have it." "No way, really?" said Rachel. "Yes, and it was probably owned by—" My sentence was suddenly interrupted by a high-pitched female voice crying, "Yoo-hoo!" It was Fee Grange, who came striding towards us with another tall lady in tow. "Darling," she cried, as she got closer, "you made it, and who is this enchanting young woman with you?" "Rachel, pleased to meet you," said Rachel, offering Fee Grange her hand. "Oh, how charming! The daughter!" cried Fee to her female companion, grabbing hold of Rachel's hand and shaking it enthusiastically. "This is my sister Mern. Mern, this is the lady I was telling you about on the phone." Mern smiled at both Rachel and I in turn, but took a particularly long, lingering look at Rachel. Rachel spotted the look instantly. "I know, you think you've met me before," she said to Mern. Mern smiled again, but didn't respond. She was a little shorter than her sister, but with the same long, willowy figure. She wore plainer, more practical clothes than Fee. Smart jeans, leather boots, and a dark jacket with a little silver diamond-studded brooch in the shape of a peacock on one lapel. The soft pink scarf around her neck complemented her shock of white hair and deep blue eyes. "Fee tells me that you'd like to know more about the de Aldeville family," she said, in the same crystal-clear accent as her sister's. "Yes, that's right," I said. "We're all so interested in the history of the old hall, too, and anything you might be able to tell us about the Pike family who lived there more recently." "Well, they are, of course, all inherently linked," she said. Then, looking directly at Rachel, continued, "You must pop by tomorrow morning, and then at me, both of you. I live just over there." She pointed in the direction of the ruined priory. "The cottage is just off the main entrance. Come by and we can chat. I have some things to show you." I woke early the next morning and wandered down to the kitchen. Rachel was already downstairs, curled up on the comfy chair with a mug of hot tea in one hand. With the other, she was rubbing her stomach and making little moaning sounds. "Too much bonfire toffee last night?" I asked, noticing the empty paper packet carelessly discarded on the table. "I will never eat that stuff again," she said firmly. I tutted at her and shook my head in mock disapproval as I picked up the toffee packet and tossed it in the bin. She made a face and pulled her noticing the old packet of documents and notebook piled at the side of her chair. "No, Mondays are too busy. We get the schools in. I spent pretty much all day herding groups of bored, snotty kids around the archive room." I grinned. "So, no more revelations about the Pikes and the Scullions, then?" "Well, there is this," she said, reaching for her notebook and opening a bookmarked page. "Sue passed this on to me. It's a computer printout of the newspaper article from 1872 that talks about Elizabeth Pike's funeral, but I haven't had time to read it yet." I took the piece of paper from her. "But we have this," I said, handing it back. "We do, but don't you remember that the bottom section of the report was missing?" she said. "No, I don't remember," I said. "But anyway, what does it say?" Rachel began reading. Late edition. "Our reporter notes that the deceased lady's inquest, which should have been held today at the Old House at Home public house, did not in fact take place. Indeed, an examination of the body, which had been authorised by Detective Heath, was cancelled at the last minute by Dr. Cuthbert Griffin, the brother of the Reverend Griffin, and the lady's funeral brought forward. Our reporter is led to believe that there had been some confusion at the mortuary. We are also informed that Dr. Cuthbert did not attend the funeral as formally reported." "What?" I exclaimed. "There was no inquest." "Should there have been?" said Rachel. "Well, yes. Elizabeth Pike died a violent death in unexplained circumstances. A coroner should have held an inquest. The body should have been examined. There would have been a jury and witnesses to cross-examine. Rachel, this is bizarre. Why did Cuthbert Griffin cancel it and bring her funeral forward?" Rachel sat open-mouthed. She looked down again at the article in her hand. "Do you think he had something to do with her death?" she asked me. "Either that, or this was a cover-up, Rachel, to bury the body before it had been examined. I'm at a loss as to why that would have been allowed." "Then this is the first piece of information we've had which might help us begin to identify the murderer," she said. "But this information was public knowledge. It's in the newspaper. Why didn't the police at the time investigate it further? It doesn't make sense," I added. "It all points to Cuthbert, Mum. He didn't attend her funeral either. Where was he?" she said. I shook my head in bewilderment. Then suddenly I had a thought. "There is something else, actually," I said, picking up my phone from the kitchen table. "It might be nothing, but you know I told you about finding Reverend Charles Griffin's book at the bookshop yesterday, the one I'm picking up this morning?" Rachel nodded. "Well, inside it is an inscription, a dedication on one of the pages at the front. I took a photograph on my phone." "What does it say?" said Rachel, standing up from the chair. She came over to me and I passed her my phone. She squinted at the image on the screen and began enlarging it with her fingers. "Oh, it was Cecil's book," she exclaimed. "The brother who was an artist." "Yes, asked. Yeah, Roman dude, Latin lyric poet and satirist under the Emperor Augustus 1st century BC, she read. But what does it mean? I said impatiently. One of the translations is punishment presses hard upon the heels of crime. Then the next bit, veritatum dies apparit, means. She stopped and stared at me wide-eyed. What? I said. Time discloses truth, she said slowly. We both looked at each other in wonder. The plot thickens, I said. Now I will read Chapter 11, The Oldervilles. We wandered down Orchard Road together and headed in the direction of the riverfront. After yesterday's bright sunshine, it was a disappointment to be met with dark and cloudy skies this morning. It seemed as if it might rain at any moment, so I'd brought along a couple of umbrellas just in case. Rachel already looked frozen, and we'd only just left the house. She wore a thick green woolen scarf around her neck, which also covered her mouth and nose, and a matching bobble hat pulled low over her ears. She mumbled something at me, but her voice was muffled under all the bulk. She pulled the scarf away from her mouth and tried again. I said, why aren't we going in the car? Why would we need to go in the car? It's not that far, I answered. Because it's freezing, she said. I thought you'd drop me off at work later. Rach, it's not that cold. The walk'll do you good, I smiled. She rolled her eyes at me and pulled the scarf back over her mouth. We wandered on in silence until we reached Priory Lane and the riverfront. It was much windier here, and it had begun to spit with rain. I handed Rachel an umbrella, which she declined with a shake of her head, and we continued on down the road. The little riverside cafe, where Stanley Fogg and I had chatted, was open, and Rachel paused to take a peek through the window at the tempting array of pink and white cakes on display. Later, I mouthed, and she nodded back in agreement. It was starting to rain quite heavily now, and I was relieved to see the frontage of Chaplin's books come into view as we carried on a little further down the road. I pushed against the faded blue shop door to open it, but it remained firmly shut. There's a note on the door, Mum, said Rachel, pulling down her scarf and pointing to one of the small glass panels in the door. Oh, hell, I said, reading the note. It's closed until this afternoon, due to illness. You're kidding, said Rachel. Mum, we need to get out of this rain. We might as well carry on to Priory Cottage then. We're a little early, but hopefully Mern won't mind, I said, handing Rachel the umbrella again, which this time she accepted. By the time we'd got to the end of the long, rutted, muddy track at the back of the old priory, which gave access to Priory Cottage, we were both soaked through. The bottoms of my jeans were splattered with mud and bits of grass, and Rachel had given up on her umbrella, which had turned inside out with the increasing gusts of wind. We both looked thoroughly miserable as we approached the small stone cottage. I knocked on the front door, and it was opened by a tall woman in a blue, paint-splattered boiler suit. Her grey hair was tied up in a purple scarf, and she had a couple of dots of white paint on her nose. Hello, Mern, I said. I'm sorry we're early, but... Oh my, you look soaked through, she said, opening the door satin scarf. I'm Ria, Mern's sister, one of the hazards of being an identical twin. Oh, sorry, I said, removing my wet coat. No worries, said Ria. Mern's in the back, baking something or other. I'm redecorating her back bedroom, which is why I look particularly glamorous today. Rachel smiled. You don't live here too, then? Live with Mern, said Ria, directing us into a small lounge. Not likely. She'd drive me crazy with her neatness, she laughed. We sat down on an overstuffed sofa next to a roaring fire. Rachel leaned forward to warm her hands as I picked off bits of damp grass from my jeans. Ria opened out a spindly metal clothes dryer next to the fire and draped our damp coats and scarves over it. I'll just go and tell Mern you're here, she said, and disappeared back into the hallway. The room was gloriously cosy and extremely tidy. Across from the sofa were two armchairs in a matching floral pattern, and there were pretty curtains hung up over the stone-framed windows. The fireplace was also constructed of the same old stone, and there was a little bread oven with a metal door at one side. The stone walls were full of neatly arranged pictures, and there was a beautiful gilt oval-framed mirror hung over the fireplace. This is gorgeous, I said to Rachel. It feels churchy, she said, pointing to the arched shape of the stone window frames. It's lovely, isn't it? Said Mern, entering the lounge with a tea tray and placing it down on an oak coffee table in front of us. The cottage was constructed in the 19th century with discarded stone from the priory. I've made tea. I hope that's okay. Yes, thank you, I said. She wandered over to one of the windows and looked out. It's really bucketing it down out there, she said. We were lucky to get here just before the heavens completely opened, I laughed. Yes, sorry about the muddy track, she said, looking over at my grimy jeans. English Heritage owns the priory and the land around it, and I've asked them more than a dozen times to put down some gravel or something. At that, Ria came into the lounge with a plate full of freshly baked cookies. Chocolate chip, anyone? She said, grinning, and passed the plate to Rachel. Yes, please, said Rachel, grabbing one of the cookies and taking a bite. I haven't had any breakfast. It was remarkable how physically alike the sisters were, despite their very different attire. Mern's neat checked skirt and cream blouse contrasted markedly with Ria's grubby overalls and headscarf, but their facial features made them almost indistinguishable. Ria took a cookie for herself and left the plate on the coffee table. She casually sat down in one of the comfy chairs opposite us and put both of her stockinged feet up onto the corner of the table. Ria, feet, shouted Mern crossly, and swiped at Ria's toes with her hand. And you didn't put a doily on the cookie plate, she continued. Ria quickly removed her feet. Sorry, Em, she said. Do you want me to be mother? Yes, you poor dear, she answered, walking over to a large wooden chest on the far side of the room. She leant over the chest and lifted the heavy lid and began rummaging around inside. Ria began pouring tea out of the pretty blue and white teapot into the four matching cups and saucers. So you've come to find out more about the D'Aldevilles? She asked. Yes, hopefully, I said. I met your sister Fee at the pub yesterday, and she said Mern was the one to speak to. You didn't eat there, did you? Said Mern suddenly, with a genuine look of concern on her face. No, I didn't, I replied cautiously. Grubby little place, isn't it, Ria? Fee has no idea about hygiene, and that blooming cat. I've told her before, secrets of our older sister? Yes, of course, said Mern. Sorry, I do get carried away. It just annoys me. Anyway, young lady, I have something for you. She handed Rachel a little brown cardboard box. I think these belong to you, she said. Oh, said Rachel, taking the box in surprise. For me? Look inside, dear, said Mern, seating herself on the comfy chair next to Rhea. Rachel lifted the lid of the box and took out a couple of small objects wrapped in pink tissue paper. She began unwrapping the paper and then looked up at me in wonder. In her hand she held 2 shiny polished brass keys. They originally came from Hallows House, said Mern. Fee tells me that you moved there recently, so it occurred to me that they really need to go back. The larger one has been in the family for years, and the smaller key was discovered by our brother Guy in the grounds of the old hall. I've kept them both safe and nicely polished ever since. Rachel turned the keys over in her hand. They have the same E&J Pike inscription on it as the other keys, Mum, said Rachel. You found other keys, said Mern in surprise. Yes, I said, we have 2 others with the same inscription on them, if that's what you mean. Well, I never, said Mern. Then these 2 definitely need to be with you. How many are there? I asked. There are 5, said Mern. At least, there should be 5, all numbered. These 2 are numbered 2 and 4. I thought the others were lost. We have numbers 1 and 3, said Rachel. It all started with number 3, which the strange man... Quickly, I squeezed my foot on top of Rachel's to make her stop. She made a small yelp and looked at me in annoyance. Would you mind if I have some milk? I asked, and gave Rachel a sharp, don't go there, look. Silly me, said Rhea. I'll get some for you from the kitchen. Where did you say that you got the 3rd key from? Asked Mern, apparently not picking up on my hasty exchange with Rachel. We found it in the house, I said quickly. Didn't we, Rachel? Rachel nodded and tried to mask her irritation with me. Do you know what they're for, and why there are 5? I asked Mern. Yes and no, said Mern. It's a complicated story, and I've been trying to work it out for a long time. Too long, said Rhea, returning from the kitchen with a small bottle of milk in her hand. Rhea, I have a milk jug, exclaimed Mern. It tastes the same whether it comes out of a bottle or a jug, said Rhea, and handed me the bottle. Or a cow, she added, grinning at Rachel. Rachel grinned back. I could see that she and Rhea were definitely kindred spirits. Our father was obsessed with the history of the Aldervilles, said Rhea, plonking herself back down in the armchair. Mern has taken on his mantle, haven't you, Em? I'm not obsessed, Rhea, said Mern, shifting in her chair, although Daddy was, I have to agree with that. Were you all born in Monk's Ferry? I asked, pouring milk into my teacup. I'm assuming the Aldervilles stayed here even after the old hall was sold to the Pike family. Oh no, said Mern. Daddy was born in London. We all were. After Radford de Alderville sold the family pile to Alpheus Pike in 1850. Suddenly she stopped and began to cross over to the trunk again. Actually, let me show you our family tree. It'll be easier to explain, she continued, and took out a centuries passed. Radford, as the oldest son, inherited the house and land after his father died, and Benedict moved down to London in his 20s. After Radford sold the old hall to the Pike family, he also moved down to London to live with his brother. "Why are you all back up here in Monk's Ferry then?" said Rachel. "And why did Radford sell the old hall? It seems peculiar to get rid of a house that had been in the family for hundreds of years." "It's simple. There was no one left to inherit," answered Rhea, picking up her cup and dipping her cookie in the warm tea. "Radford remained a bachelor all his life, and his brother Benedict didn't want it, preferred to stay in London, and Father's obsession with the family history brought us all back up here." "Actually, it's not that simple, sister," said Mern. "There's much more to it than that, and will you stop dipping your biscuit? It makes a soggy mess at the bottom of the cup." Rhea dipped her cookie again and smirked at Rachel, who grinned back. Mern ignored her sister's defiance and picked up a bundle of photographs that she'd taken out of the old trunk. She handed a small black and white photo to Rachel. "This is Mummy, Daddy and the four of us in 1954. It's the year Daddy became incumbent at All Hallows Church, and we all moved up from London and into the vicarage. This is Rhea and I sitting on the wall at the bottom of the front garden in matching floral dresses." "How I hated those matching dresses," Rhea got in. "And that's Fee, looking as distracted as always," continued Mern. "You see, she's not even looking at the camera." "And the older boy is your brother, who found one of the keys?" asked Rachel. "Does he still live around here too?" Mern sighed. "No, unfortunately Guy tragically died a year after we arrived in Monk's Ferry. He was only 15 years old. It was all very sad." "I'm so sorry," I said. "How dreadful for you all." "He was swimming out to the lighthouse with a friend and got into trouble in the deep water," said Mern. "They say it was an accident," she added cynically. "It was an accident," said Rhea firmly. "Mern has a tendency to turn everything into a conspiracy." "My sister and I have differing opinions on the matter," said Mern crossly. Rhea placed her cup and saucer back down on the coffee table. She stood up and walked over to the doorway. "You'll notice that Father's obsession with the de Aldeville family also lives on in our names," she said, turning to face Rachel and I. "Our brother was named after the first de Aldeville, who came over with William the Conqueror. Fee was named after his wife, Fuchsia, and Mern and I were named after the family cats." "We were not," exclaimed Mern. Rhea mouthed, "Yes, we were," at Rachel, which made her giggle. "Anyhow," Rhea continued, "I'll say my goodbyes to you ladies. Some of us have a bedroom to decorate." After Rhea had left the room, Mern offered us more tea from the blue and white teapot. "I'm afraid Rhea isn't really interested in the family's history," she said. "It bores her. Now, where were we?" "You were going to tell us about the keys," I said. "Yes, that's right," answered Mern. "But before I do, I think you need to understand more about the de Aldevilles and, in particular, their connection with Elizabeth Pike." "Elizabeth Pike?" said Rachel in surprise. "Yes," said Mern, "the poor young woman who was murdered at the old hall all those years ago. Do you know about that?" "Yes, we know some of it," I answered. "Actually, it's what got us interested in finding out more about the whole history." "Then let me show you some things first," said Mern, rifling through some more of her photographs. She pulled out a large colour photo from the pile. It was a copy of an old painting in an elaborate gilt frame. It's the same clock. What does it mean? Asked Rachel. I'm not sure. But what it does confirm to me, answered Mern, is the Pike's keenness to appropriate the de Aldeville family history. I don't understand, I said. Well, they didn't just buy the old hall, its furniture, contents and grounds. They also bought into the de Aldeville's ancient past, their history, even their crest. The peacock was the original symbol of the de Aldevilles for centuries, and the Pikes adopted it as their own. This is just another example of Alpheus Pike attempting to redefine himself as the new lord of the manor, so to speak. Of course, the fountain with the peacock on top, said Rachel. Oh, you've seen it, said Mern. Rachel squirmed in her seat. Not exactly, no. I dreamt about it. Mern was silent. She slowly tapped the photograph on the table and then carefully placed it back down. She picked up her cup of tea and brought it to her lips. Then she turned to Rachel. You've been having a lot of strange dreams lately, Rachel, haven't you? She said quietly. Rachel looked at me nervously and then turned back to Mern. Yes, she said. How did you know? There's much to tell, Rachel, answered Mern, and not all of it makes sense. The skies outside had begun to darken, and Mern reached over to turn on a table lamp, just as a large flash of lightning lit up the small room. It was closely followed by a loud clap of thunder, and Rachel flinched at my side. I placed my hand reassuringly on her arm as Mern continued. The de Aldevilles had a secret, and it involved Elizabeth Pike, the 5 keys, and ultimately her murder. And now we go on to Chapter 12, titled Secrets. There was another sudden flash of lightning, accompanied a few seconds later by a low rumble of thunder. The light from the lamp flickered slightly. Rachel excused herself and went to find the bathroom, and Mern and I were left alone. I picked up my teacup and finished the last dregs of my tea, and Mern crossed to the fireplace and began stirring some of the coals with an iron poker. More flashes of lightning continued sporadically to light up the room, but the rumbles of thunder were becoming quieter and more distant. The storm was beginning to move away. How do you know that Rachel has been having strange dreams? I asked Mern, as I placed my empty teacup back in its saucer. Because I had them too, said Mern. I dreamt about the fountain with the peacock on top, and other things. You say you had dreams. Did they stop at some point? Yes, said Mern. After I moved away from the vicarage, I suppose I was in my mid-20s, I married and came to the cottage. The dreams stopped, but my enthusiasm for finding out more didn't. You know, I said carefully, looking down and unsure what Mern's reaction would be. Stanley Fogg told me that Fee and his brother Bert had seen ghosts at the old hall. Mern shook her head. Not ghosts, plural, and not Fee either. It was me who saw the Blue Lady, as we called her. Stan gets everything wrong. I smiled and she continued. He saw her more than I did. I was close friends with Bert as a teen. We were pretty much cousins, really. The fountain is in his back garden. Oh yes, I said. Fee told me that your mother was a Fogg, too. Yes, Daddy met her on one of his regular visits to Monk's Ferry. He began researching the de Aldeville history in his early 20s and often made research trips to the town. She worked at a local hotel. It isn't there anymore. Daddy stayed there all the time, and the rest This is oat and linseed. It's delicious with cheese. Are you both happy with cheddar? Rachel and I nodded enthusiastically, and Mern handed us a small plate and a napkin each. Please help yourselves, ladies, she said, passing us the large plate full of sandwiches. She wandered over to an oak sideboard and brought back a heavily laden fruit bowl. For afters, she said, smiling. This is very kind of you, Mern, I said. The bread is delicious. It's wonderful that I have the opportunity to share my enthusiasm for the Alderville family history with you both. Ria suddenly appeared at the lounge door. Ooh, sandwiches, she said. She was just about to sit down and help herself to a plate when Mern put out her hand. Oh, no, you don't, she warned. Ria, you're covered in paint. Please go and get changed before you do anything. This is all I've got, Ria replied, looking down at her paint-splattered hands and even grubbier boiler suit. Then go and grab an old towel to sit on, replied Mern in frustration. Ria disappeared again, and Mern sighed. Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, Elizabeth Pike. Now, take a look at this. It explains a lot of things. She placed an old brown leather-bound photograph album on the coffee table and carefully began to turn over each page. She stopped and rotated the album around to face us. Now, this particular photograph is called a calotype and was taken in 1846 in the Sundial courtyard in the grounds of the old hall. Rachel and I took a close look at the old sepia-coloured image. The Sundial courtyard, said Rachel, her eyes widening suddenly. We know this place. It's at the back of our garden. We found it yesterday afternoon, didn't we, Mum? We did, I said. The picture showed a formal group of 5 males standing around a small, seated, middle-aged woman in a white dress and bonnet. On either side of the group were 2 large urns raised up on stone plinths. The woman had her hand on the handle of an old-fashioned baby carriage, and her face was turned towards the direction of the raised hood and the baby inside. Who are they? Said Rachel. The 2 older men with the beards and top hats are Radford and Benedict de Alderville, the brothers, said Mern. The 2 younger men standing to either side of them are Benedict's sons, Ramsay, our great-great-grandfather. He's the one with the dark-coloured hair and the smart suit, and his older brother Victorious, the slightly taller, fur-haired man. Victorious, I mused. You all have such interesting names. Not so interesting, interjected Ria, returning with a brown towel under her arm. Imagine having to spend most of your life as Auroria Valencia Lord de Alderville, and Mother only called me Valencia because it was her favourite place in Spain. At least you managed to condense it down to plain old Ria Smith, dear, said Mern, taking the towel off her sister and placing it neatly on the comfy chair. True. I told George it was the main reason I married him, said Ria, sitting down on the towel and helping herself to some sandwiches. I smiled to myself. The de Alderville sisters' relationship was fascinating. They seemed to be both caring and irritated with each other in equal measure. Rachel looked at the photograph again while she munched on another sandwich. He has a haunted look about him, she said. Victorious, I mean. He looks pale and thin, and his eyes are quite deep set. Yes, said Mern. From all accounts, he was a troubled soul. It's the last picture we have of him. How so? I asked. He went missing some weeks after this photograph was taken and was never seen or heard of again. Gosh, said Rachel. So, who are the other 2 people? Ah, now This is where it gets interesting, said Mern, pointing to the woman seated next to the baby carriage. This is Agnes Chaplin. She was the cook at the old hall, and the man standing next to her, with his hand placed reassuringly on her shoulder, is her husband Donald. He was the family's butler. Chaplin, I said. I was in Chaplin's bookshop yesterday. Are they related? Everyone is related to everyone else in this town, murmured Ria, picking up a banana from the fruit bowl. Why were the servants included in a formal photograph of the family? Said Rachel. Well, that's where the secret lies, said Mern. It was Daddy who worked it all out. It's all to do with the Alderville scandal, cried Ria theatrically, hurling her banana skin into the fire. Scandal? Asked Rachel. Yes, said Mern. You see, the baby in the pram is Elizabeth de Alderville, or, as she was to become, Elizabeth Pike. Rachel stared at Mern, open-mouthed. That doesn't make any sense, she gasped. She was Ebenezer and Joseph Pike's sister, wasn't she? That is what everybody outside of the family was led to believe, said Mern slowly. But even the Pike brothers were aware that their sister was not like them. Have you been to her grave in the churchyard? Yes, Rachel nodded. Then you will have read the inscription on the stone, said Mern. I have it written down in a notebook in my satchel, said Rachel, rising from the sofa and moving to the hallway where she'd left her bag. She brought back the still soggy satchel and placed it on the floor, and retrieved her notebook from inside. Finding the page where she'd copied down the inscription, she read aloud, Here lies the body of fair Elizabeth Pike, mistress of the old hall. Then she stopped and scanned through the rest of the lines with her finger. Further down the inscription, she began again. High-born, in spirit and in virtue. Mern, you think the brothers were implying that she was the real mistress of the old hall, that she actually was high-born, of aristocratic birth? Yes, said Mern plainly. You see, Daddy discovered that Victorious de Alderville was her father. She pointed back to the slim, fair-haired young man in the photograph, standing awkwardly next to his father, Benedict. But if that's true, said Rachel, then why was Elizabeth brought up with the Pikes? I'm confused. It's a long story, said Mern. In that case, I'm back on painting duty, said Ria, suddenly rising from her chair and dashing for the doorway. I'll catch you two ladies another time. How much time populous, bustling London. Plus, Radford refused to allow his wayward nephew to leave the house and grounds, and alcohol, of course, was strictly off limits. So Victorious would wander around the lonely hall with its many rooms like a lost soul, day after day, with only the servants to chat to. A couple of weeks after he arrived, through sheer devilry, he broke into his uncle's study and found in a desk drawer a velvet bag containing a number of brass keys. "Our keys?" asked Rachel. "Yes, the same," said Mern. There were 5 in total, held together on a brass ring. Victorious's curiosity was piqued, and so he went around the hall with them, trying to open up any door or cupboard that he could find, but to no avail. In the end he was caught one night attempting to return the keys to his uncle's study. Radford was furious and punished his rebellious nephew by confining him to his rooms for a week. As you can guess, that didn't hold Victorious for long. One evening he climbed out of a window and made his way to one of the local inns in the town. After weeks of abstinence, he got thoroughly drunk and involved in an argument with a local man. The landlord sent him on his way, and as Victorious staggered back to the old hall that night, he encountered one of the young kitchen maids that he had befriended. One thing led to another, and 9 months later she had a child that she named Elizabeth. Rachel sat next to me, open-mouthed and thoroughly captivated by Mern's story. "What happened next?" I asked, equally gripped. Mern turned to the pages of the old photograph album, back to the original image of the 5 men and seated woman. The maid's parents approached Radford and informed him of Victorious's role in their daughter's predicament, continued Mern. Rachel looked down at the photograph. "So the cook and the butler were the maid's parents?" she asked. "Yes, they were," said Mern. "Agnes and Donald Chaplin were the grandparents of Elizabeth de Aldeville, as she was baptised." Victorious reluctantly confessed to his involvement with their daughter, and it was agreed that the child be brought up in secret at the hall. "Then where do the Pikes come into this?" I asked. Mern sighed. "Well, as I mentioned before, a couple of weeks after this photograph was taken, Victorious went missing. It was assumed that he had run away from Monk's Ferry and headed back to London, but if he did, he never returned to his father's house. Benedict's letters seem to suggest that his wayward son simply disappeared without trace." "How awful," I said.